ジャギ様から盗み取った北斗神拳、北斗を味合わせてやるわ。
Hello everybody, welcome to the video. My name is Midway and today I bring you some gameplay as always as I hold the Paladin. This time doing some Mythic Plus on Shadowmoon Boreal Grounds. A long time since we last run this dungeon, at least I did. And this is from Warlords of Dweiner. We are running a melee build that in a second we'll be explaining. But yeah, we'll be showing some gameplay and we'll discuss some things along the way. So here is the build that we chose to run for this dungeon. So very quickly, this is the build that we chose to run this dungeon, and as you can see, we finally have Blessing of Seasons. We dropped Resonance for it, so we are able to buff our allies and just get a little bit of that rolling. We also chose to not run Second Sunrise, so we don't have those extra lights at dawn. We are really using a very little light at dawn. We're also using Unwavering Spirit so we can have a little bit more aura masteries, just testing how this feels, as well as testing the numbers of Save by the Light. The big deal breaker of this build is that we are not running with Light of the Martyr, so we don't have that option if we are in a really desperate situation. And we also opted to not choose Imbued Infusions, which is quite nice when we cast some Flash of Lights or Holy Lights. Now we are playing a regular melee build, so on the left side we're going to go with Aspirations of Divinity for some extra main stat when we use Crusader Strike, and we are running the normal Mad Paragon together with Sanctified Wrath, and also just having a regular build with Arcade so we can go in there and contribute to the dungeon. Now, as you might have seen, this build is a melee build and we are not running with some crucial things. I would at least deem them crucial, and in that case I would mention Light of the Martyr as crucial because I just rely on it a little bit. I wouldn't say too much, but a lot in my general gameplay as a Holy Paladin. But nonetheless, we are also trying out some things like trying to see what the throughput of Saved by the Light would be. We'll see that it doesn't really do too much, but it's nice to try and see what these things are doing nowadays. We are also not running with Judgment of Light. We are using Golden Path instead. Ever since Judgment of Light got nerfed, we are just not doing as much healing with it, so we instead choose to run with Golden Path, which gives us a lot more survivability. It's a lot more of a self-sustained sort of spell. And yeah, we are also running with Blessing of Seasons. Now, it's not that big of a deal, not when you're not running with a comp where you're in comms and you're making conscious decisions, especially around Blessing of Summer. But here we just chose to run it for the sake of seeing how it flows. I mean, nothing's really changed with it. It just plays like it used to back in Shadowlands, but we just chose to weave it into this build, and it does feel alright. I mean, you have the same choices as before. It's good whenever you need a little bit of extra healing to have access to Blessing of Spring, I believe it is. And for the most part, it's really just going to come down to Blessing of Summer, maybe Blessing of Autumn, whenever you might probably going to be dropping that on some of the DPS, to be fair. But yeah, there's some cool things that you can do with it. Also, maybe dropping Blessing of Spring, I believe it's Spring, onto the tanks. Whoever or whenever you're running with a tank that has a lot of self-healing, using that on them is pretty much giving them 25% increased healing, so that's just making their life a lot easier for 30 seconds. That, together with 1 minute Blessing of Sacrifice, is just a lot of tank utility that you bring. Now here we cut the video a little bit short because we chose to run towards the right side of the path, so don't mind too much, but for the most part this dungeon plays pretty well. You might notice I don't have nameplates. I had some UI issues with Plater, so I chose not to use Plater for this dungeon, and I'm not able to see the HP of the mob, so don't worry too much about that. Also, sorry for the quality of the video. I couldn't really record on a higher quality. I'll try to do so in the next videos coming up, but I do the best that I can with what I have, and for now this is gonna have to suffice. Looks a little bit not too great, but regardless, the dungeon itself felt pretty well, pretty good. If you've run this dungeon before, it's quite an interesting one. I've always liked it. When it comes to numbers, it's hard to say. They're changing a lot of things about these dungeons. They're tweaking and tuning a lot of the bosses, mainly, also trash packs and whatnot. But it just felt like an okay dungeon, not too hard, not too easy. Now, this compared to many of the new dungeons in Dragonflight felt a lot more forgiving, mainly because, well, in the newer dungeons in Dragonflight, there's just a lot of stuff happening. For the most part, every trash pack has a kick that you need to deal with, every mob does a bunch of abilities, and when you go back to these older dungeons from Legion and Draenor in this case, even back to Mists of Pandaria, we'll go to that one in a couple days with a new video, you'll see that everything is just a little bit easier. It just seems like every mob is a little bit simpler, and therefore playing the dungeon just feels a little bit more fun because there's less things that are just creating a big clusterfuck. A big difference with, for example, the one of the newer dungeons, the Nakut Offensive, where everything just seems to have a bunch of abilities. You get what I mean. It seems like there's a big bloat of things going on in the newer dungeons, and going back to these older dungeons that are a little bit simpler is just a refreshing touch, which brings it back to the basics. And I do like it quite a little bit. Now, also, it's the first time that I mentioned before that I played this dungeon in a long time, so I might just be biased towards the freshness of it. And I've played it many times in the past, so I know what the mechanics were. I was not really going into it blind at all. But you can see the damage happening here is pretty low. We're running this with only Fortified and Thundering on a plus 15 level, so that's pretty much the highest you can do these keys now. You can also push them up, and then you just change the key from one thing to the other, so you could actually do 20s or whatever, but it's not really the point. We're just trying to put it to a point where you can test the dungeon and actually have things not die too quickly. But that boss, you know, felt pretty okay here, you know. Feels pretty bad to not have nameplates. It does feel a little bit annoying, especially when I'm trying to kick. I'm getting into the groove of really contributing to being able to kick things, so it's really nice. Actually, it feels pretty good when you're pogging, especially being able to use that kick and actually prevent very bad situations from happening. That's really your objective as a healer. It's really the support role in the game. You're there to make the group not die and just keep them all alive, so that also goes through being good at kicking, and now as paladins we really need to be getting very good at that. Now, usually, of course, if you're doing this in a set group, you would be assigned to certain kicks and whatnot. Here we're just kicking things randomly, which is always better than not kicking whatsoever. But yep, the dungeon itself, I like it. I like how it feels. The build, we are playing a melee build as normal. We, I believe we did not enchant our gear at this point yet, but I did enchant all the gear and I tried different trinkets. We'll talk about those after the dungeon is done. But the gear now feels powerful enough so that we are kind of rinsing things. We have a little bit more haste as well. I do not have the weak core enabled, but I believe we are like at 20–23% haste on these dungeons, which already starts to feel a lot better. Now, going back to retail, I was doing that back and forth these days, and I had about 35% in retail for some reason, and it just feels like a monumental difference. Also, the lag, we are playing on the beta, so these servers are on NA, I am on EU, so I have about 200 ping, always feels bad, but nonetheless, it feels pretty good just playing regular melee build. It's really not too different from what you had in Shadowlands, really. It feels exactly the same, I would almost say, but we always have access to those little flavorful things, such as Divine Favor, which comes in pretty nicely in many times in many regards, different bosses, and also just having Divine Toll always feels like a blessing. But the big thing and the good thing that I really want you all to understand and get out of this is that you can build around every single dungeon and really build around the specific scenarios on the dungeon that you really fear. Whenever we're talking about the ultra high edge of the content, that will always not be the case, but regardless, if you're just going to be playing this the way you want, you can always tailor your builds around what you like the most, or rather what you feel like is going to help you the most for the dungeon in particular. So testing things out and playing around with things feels pretty good. I've been enjoying doing that quite a bit, even though a lot of the things are not too impactful. A lot of the new talents, especially on the left side of the tree, disregard all the keystones, of course, those are always going to be impactful, but namely on the class side of the tree, there's a lot of the things that are just very watered down, things that we already had, things that we pretty much took for granted, and we're just getting them rehashed, right? So that's not the greatest thing ever, but regardless, makes up for a little bit of a good set of decisions here and there. I always like this boss. I think it's pretty interesting. It does feel a little bit like these bosses are a bit too easy now that I think about it. When I was doing some of the bosses in other dungeons, on plus 15 as well, they felt quite harder, at least healing wise. These couple bosses were quite easy. Now the last boss itself will be a different beast. That's quite a healing intensive boss, but we're also playing with some people that I know in this key. It was a complete bug. We did not get into comps or anything, but we just somehow ended up in the same key, so that was good. Some people that I know that they're pretty good on this dungeon. So yeah, not really much to add here. Now, number-wise, we'll talk about that in whenever we are done with the dungeon. We'll break down the details, we'll check out the damage, we'll check out the healing, we'll talk about the gear for a second there. I tried a little bit of different trinkets, and I mean, it's gonna come down to, are you able to pick some more offensive options, so you are always going to be choosing to build, you know, damage trinkets, or are you going to be niche, or rather just gonna need the healing a lot more, like we did in Season 4, where the healing from healers was much more needed than the damage, and instead just choose much safer options. Or for the most part, as always, Holy Paladins, we end up just picking stat sticks then that give us procs, and I do believe that will probably be the case, but regardless, we'll have to see. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Not in detail, but a little bit more once we're done with the key. So for now, I'll just leave you with the gameplay. It's gonna be about 20 minutes of this dungeon, just so you can enjoy looking at what the dungeon felt like, and I'll also add the sounds from the actual dungeon, so you don't have to just listen to some music if you don't like that. But regardless, yeah, I'll see you at the end of the dungeon so we can break down the details a little bit more. Hello, I'm back again, and yeah, we're looking at the last boss, Nershul. We did wipe on him once. It's actually quite a rough boss, as I mentioned before, and we're also gonna be pretty much formatting this, but the reason why this boss feels a lot more healing intensive is just because you need to play it properly. It seems like we didn't really do so too much, but yeah, we kinda have to move away from those beams, those purple beams that are falling right in front of us. The closer you are to those, the more damage you're taking. So yeah, you can kind of like take almost no damage from them, but you really will take a lot of damage as they are first spawning. You need to be pretty quick with them. As always, you will get weak auras once everything's figured out, so you will pretty much be able to tell when they're coming down. You can bait them away, you can move back, you can stack, you can whatever. So those things will always be figured out. But just playing it like this, you know, that one beam just spawned right there and that guy run right in front of it. Also remember, you have a battle res. Right here I don't have a way of tracking it, but it's really nice being able to just rest people in the middle of the action. It just seems like with a kick and a battle res, Paladin just feels so much more complete. Now, we might not be meta or whatever, that will always change or depend, but regardless, sorry, Paladin just feels like a much more complete spec right now, at least Holy Paladin does. And I do feel like, you know, we just got a lot of nice things that make playing Holy Paladin a lot more engaging and entertaining. We feel a little bit more powerful, I would say, as a class, rather than just as numbers-wise and whatnot. But yeah, the boss itself is pretty interesting. It's gonna last for a little bit because we are formatting it, but it doesn't really do too much. It's just a matter of the numbers, and I do believe this will be a boss that once you get that figured out, it won't be too scary. But regardless, maybe a DPS check with those walls you remember having to kill them before they get to you. But yeah, I did like it. It was the first challenge, the first actual healing challenge here we had in this dungeon, I believe. And I quite enjoyed it. Now, there will be a lot more healing challenges in the coming videos. I have a bunch of videos that I've recorded this weekend that I had some time. And you will see that we do quite well against them. We're always doing them on 15 and plus 15 level, and we are not running them on Tyrannical. But there's going to be quite some stuff that's going to make you, you know, put you on edge. Now, let's just say that having Divine Toll is just coming in really handy, but also the power of Holy Shock has been diminished so much throughout the expansion, the Shadowlands, and namely getting into Dragonflight. Holy Shock it got nerfed by 10%, so Divine Toll is really not what it was, but regardless, that will always scale up with more gear and whatnot, and yep. Overall, just feels like we have quite some options, and that big comeback button always feels really nice. So yeah, let's now look at the breakdown here. We have our healing done, as you can see, as always. Beacon of Light's gonna be our top healing, Word of Glory, whatsoever, blah, Holy Shock, Glimmer. That's as always, nice as always. But then we also have Burning Embers. Now, Burning Embers is a trinket that I was running that's applying a buff onto some allies. Eventually, it's gonna be proccing, and it's going to be healing some people for quite a meaningful amount, as you can see, but it's also going to be doing some damage. Now, I also had this other trinket that I completely forgot to add to my bars. Now, that trinket applies a shield to one person, and after a couple seconds or where the shield expires, it's going to be applying it to the whole group. So it's quite nice. That shield could be quite impactful when you know what's going on. And then we have the damage breakdown here. Nothing too crazy here. We have a lot of damage from Glacier Fear as always, but as you can see, Burning Embers did quite some numbers, so I believe that trinket could be quite a contender there. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you on the next one. See ya!